Tall Tales. The Nymph Symphony.
Chapters.
Chapter 28. Truth. Our fall felt prolonged, as if we had come in at a much higher height than what we had initially dived in from. We broke directly through layers of thin twigs and dry hollow branches while toppling down a leafless and deathly tree canopy, dreadfully awaiting the fiery sting of back-breaking impact, while we flipped our bodies around and tucked them inwards, preparing for a solid and harsh collision with the unseen shady hillside below. Bludgeoned into blackened soil and dirt, we had smacked down against the dark mossy hillside slope, only to continue slipping down the forest's steep mountainside, disjointed from each other as we burst through piled barricades of town bark, twigs, and other built-up tree roughage without any apparent loss of momentum or speed. The two of us rolling like barrels as we lost each other to our own tumbling downhill rattle roll and the upcoming darkness ahead. I was holding my breath in a hope to lessen all imminent pain I was next to feel, always fearing the fierce impact of a solid tree stump surely to be blocking my way somewhere down the line, only to be luckily but abruptly saved by a soft, small, sinking mound of extra loose forest soil, dropping me halfway down into a pool of lumpy and dry quicksand, as it snagged and caught my feet first before I could continue with any more dizzying barrel rolls. Content for that moment to lay still in brief paralysis, slowly feeling the tingle of lengthy cuts and grazes apparent across my arms and hips, I was relieved to have just stopped moving altogether and be given the chance to wait out the stinging numbness across my body. Unable to find comfort and rest for long, though, I started squirming against the powdery soil with a fighter's resilience before eventually surrendering to it, and just accepting my bog situation for what it was, my thoughts taking over as I fought all further temptation to restlessly struggle and instead temporarily gave in to allow the shallow pit of dirt extra time in suspension, as it offered me at least a peaceful moment's break to evaluate where I was and the position I'd found myself in. Clearly I was stuck in a standstill. My figure remained buried down to the elbows and yet luckily about as far as I could sink down, leaving me there until I ultimately decided to calmly try and decompress my way out of it. The long, careful process of slowly and lightly swimming my nails through the dirt of both denser side walls while at the same time sinking my feet down till I could feel something more solid to kick up off, finding the harder ground I could push off in order to rise up and out from the puffy decomposing heap of unearthed soil I had fallen into, managing to do so with a surprisingly easy level of effort when compared to mindless thrashing about. Once I had pushed myself up and out of that tiny square ditch-like tomb, I was determined to work out where Arlo and I both were. I took no time in scouring upwards and through the deadly valley treetops in inspection of the vast mountainous hillside plain I had rolled down from. I looked up to the fullest and brightest moon I had ever seen in my life. Through the trees to the side of me, far over by a long sideways running cliff, was a huge gorge that ran completely parallel, a path that trailed back up to the highest peak of the hill we had just come from, where another adjacent cliff and a second huge drop-off point that seemed to lead down to an ocean, much like the one above the castle. It was a view remarkably similar to the one you would get from our capital and its 4 high-rise corner towers. In quick reflection, I started to realize that the only substantial difference to where I was and the capital I'd just come from was the lack of a castle, its twilight, and an abnormally heavy and loud tide that raged against the rocks below the giant hillside cliffs, as much of it channeled inwards and right up the long endless river gorge that separated the low-level mainland from the high impervious hills of the mountainous peak I was standing up upon. After further comparison of its dead trees and distant hinterlands beyond, the place was too dark, foggy, and motionless to interpret what things were beside me. I had to squint just to focus on what was close to me, typically a thing you would only do when the wind is heavy in your eyes. But in this case, there was no wind where I was. No wind at all while I tried to inspect the layout of the structures and objects in close proximity of me. I couldn't help but feel like I knew exactly where I was, and that I had been in this particular place a million times before. I was bewildered by the fact that everything felt familiar and uncanny to me, and that if it weren't for a few open clearings of trees and a missing concrete marketplace paved beneath my feet, it would have seemed that I hadn't changed any location at all. I turned back towards the underlying soil I crawled out of, kicking off crushed up old dry leaves from my shoes, finding the ground unnaturally soft and bouncy, as it must have helped blanket a great deal of my fall. It was then that I realized what the covered-up rectangular patch in the dirt was and why it was threaded so perfectly between two large old willow trees. This realization made me tremble long before I looked over to find the small faded tombstone planted at the very front of it, confirming my horrific suspicions. I had fallen into someone else's decomposing grave, and that made me scream loudly. I covered my mouth quickly to stymie any further noise. I was in a foreign and wild territory, and as scared as I was, screaming like that was a death sentence while among all the carnivorous nocturnal predators of the dark. And so, trying to be logical, after a brief moment to inspect the trees for rustles of stalking movement, I sucked up my courage and went over to that willow tree to take a better look at the tombstone plaque and the name inscribed. It was made from broken pieces of old, moldy concrete, and it had strange hieroglyphics engraved on it, a language I had seen sketched on some of the walls within the Hotel Capricorn, but nothing I could actually understand. My fingers firmly touched against the grave as I tried to brush off covering moss, enough to shatter it into crumbling pieces and make me leap backwards in a delayed shock of it falling over. I walked backwards until I tripped against the dark paving gate that held a paddock of more graves that I near tumbled straight over and into. My heart continued to jolt in terror, regardless of where I moved my eyes. I was in an old cemetery after all. Clouded mists of midnight fog began to separate, revealing to me each lurking tombstone and grave. I could see them everywhere I looked. Going as far downhill of that gated path as the eye could see, there were countless rows of generic grave sites beside each oak and willow tree available, all of them ashed abundantly throughout that whole hilly graveyard site I was in the center of. Shadows of concrete stones made up multiple distant mausoleums and crypts where I believed similar-looking housing flats should have been, as many of them even seemed to be interconnected underground by a series of webby tunnels not too dissimilar to the royal catacomb bunkers. My anxiety had reached an all-time high, accentuated by the sheer fact that I was, for the moment, all alone. "You're okay. Everything's fine. The quiet is good," I kept trying to remind myself, simply trying to adjust to a new cold and foggy landscape I was ill-dressed and prepared for. I glanced around, quickly checking for silent stalking movements nearby, looking down upon the dried blood along my arms that trickled down like tiny little rivers that weaved left and right around the grooves of goosebumps as the light of my necklace exposed the truth of just how cold and afraid I was. My dread only ever able to ease when I reminded myself of how deathly still and quiet the graveyard was. The calming thought that I must have been in a place that no one had traveled to in a long time. I followed along the downhill gated path, trying to account for where it stopped and started, due to the scattering of erupted posts and other ornaments, such as wooden seating that had long since rotted and rusted to decade-old neglect. A pathing clearly dilapidated due to both a long lack of maintenance as well as some form of serious vandalism and desecration. Ordinarily, over time the forest tends to reclaim its dominance in all things forgotten, but the forest I could see was clearly too sick to fight back anymore. Spurts of erupted vines spat out of almost every structure, while it seemed only mushrooms, weeds, and roots of dead former trees appeared to be capable of repossessing ownership of their disintegrating highland. Unfortunately for me, despite a huge lack of leaves to block my view, I had still lost all sight of Arlo upon my sinking impact with the grave, and knew only that he had continued toppling down the small hillside somewhere well ahead of me, vanishing into the fog and deeper unknown. So ready to start chasing after him, I needed to find the prince but was staggered initially over how best to do that. I argued with myself about whether I should call out his name, but ultimately figured that would be ill-advised, given the terrain and situation, my mind going against my more primal and basic instincts, as I decided it would be safest to creep slowly and search for him instead. There were many similarities that matched the capital along my walk, such as each unique bend of larger trees and old clumped piles of rock deposits, unmoved from where they ordinarily sat inside the castle by the most eastern edges. I knew which way to walk, as I felt as if I hadn't left the capital at all, but rather had been displaced into a land virtually identical to my home, only one much darker and grimmer than what I had grown to love. I noticed how there were no leaves on the trees or bushes at all, that the forest canopy was completely exposed to the elements, revealing a full scatter of stars across a foggy but cloudless nocturnal skyline. The lack of life troubled me deeply, Even if it was a good thing to have, it just didn't feel right to be able to see things so exposed and uncovered. We're back in the world I knew, being exposed to the elements without a strong protective companion. Should have led to me being swarmed by dozens of big wild predators, much like all stories survivors of the famine used to recall. And yet, of all things strange, I was alone in the dark, completely unharmed by the wild. It seemed that I was in a place truly condemned. I felt like I might have died from the fall and was just left wandering through an astral plane of dry, rotting emptiness. A hellish world in which the trees and bushes looked as if they were just one more acidic storm away from being uprooted or melted away altogether. It was as if the whole landscape were facing severe drought, with only the most primitive ferns and fungi capable of clinging to life. I continued to follow along the pebbled remains of their maiden path towards the middle center, looking around cautiously as I evaluated the nightmare I was caught within, unable to shake the thoughts that perhaps Milena had been right about everything, and that all she wanted to do was keep us away from a place like this at all costs. How futile my efforts felt to be, after personally seeing the aftermath of a rainforest suffocated by drought, the very kind of famine our Sunspire actively prevented from ever happening to us. Plagued by doubt and vulnerability, part of me hoped I was simply dreaming, that I had fallen prey to one of Delphi's dramatic premonitions and was merely envisioning a nightmarish future of our world, if Midas never built the spire for us, in order to teach me a lesson about messing with things I didn't understand. My deepest fears of alienation and abandonment had virtually been brought to life. The fear of being left alone, cold and starving in the darkness, happening to be the only thing compelling me to push forwards, as I wanted to do nothing more than speed up, find Arlo, and learn how to get out of their shadowing world, even if it meant leaving before I found my best friend and princess. It was a weird sensation of knowing precisely where I was and yet having no clue of where exactly I needed to go. I questioned whether old philosophical discussions I'd had with Akoni were true all along, whether we had accidentally broken the very thread of time and reality and jumped into the future, becoming lost under a deep, dreamless hibernation inside the void between space, only to come back out of the vortex a huge number of years later, or whether it was perhaps by some equally dramatic absurdity that we had found ourselves inside a new world altogether, one that happened to greatly resemble our own world, if not for a few subtle yet highly cascading number of changes. The second hypothetical situation sounded much worse on the surface than the first, but it happened to be all I was hoping for at least it was not as irreversible as having slept dormant for years and years, only to arise back into a world where everyone we knew and loved was dead. From those thoughts, I started feeling a panic need to pace quicker than what I was, search every gravesite and barky shrubbery for the presence of my possibly injured prince. But after turning my head quickly and realizing there were dozens of small tiny twigs caught in my hair, it struck me with a small triumph, a victory and accomplishment, that Arlo and I had indeed found the gnolls' homeland. That feeling drove me to tell myself the mission only felt like a failure because I was letting it do so, that if anything, by the same token of luck and determination, I should be able to find a way out of the hellhole I'd put Arlo and me into. And so, prioritizing the need to look for Arlo, I also tried to keep in mind that I needed to also find and obtain whatever transdimensional stone or device the gnolls must have been using in order to enter and exit our world upon their free will. The motives of why those scavengers attacked our world becoming remarkably clear to me as I continued to search through the emptiness of their wisp-forsaken wilderness in search of my prince. I continued down a ghostly trail towards the lowest grounds of the hill, trying to stay positive, despite each crypt and corner I turned giving me less and less chance to ever find Arlo again. I was becoming less secure about where I was as each moment pushed on. I found it harder to maintain my silence as each leaned-over gate and bush led to nothing more than further dirt and graves. My hands went from freely touching and feeling every surface curiously to being tucked to my sides at all times. I started to avoid all broken railings and ledges as fear started to fester within me, too afraid to lean anywhere that was too far into the shadows, fearing a multitude of gnolls' claws shooting out and taking hold of me if I did so. I wasn't sure why I was so timid, why I wasn't using a chance like the one I had to truly test the limits of my powers. I had always assumed that my confidence would grow along with the strength and prevalence of the shadows, but if anything, I was going out of my way to refrain myself from bringing the whole forest to life each time I was spooked in minor alarm. The fact was if I wanted to, I could mold shadows as large as monuments. I could condense a shade into that of solid stone and build myself a castle fortress for Arlo and me to shelter in. And yet the fear of accidentally hurting myself or him in the construction of it stopped me. The darkness in which things unseen could hide was almost preventing me from checking everywhere thoroughly. Instead of properly jumping gates and checking crevices behind posts and stone housings, I was rubbing my arms to warm them as I started sternly whispering, "Arlo, Arlo," towards the corners I couldn't see. The night was shockingly cold, and I was doing my best just to shiver through it, finding it difficult to repel a deeply unforgiving atmosphere. I found the lack of respect to the crypts and broken statues sight disturbing. I was surprised to see an old Nick statue on the path where courtyards would be in my world, centered among more tarnished tombstones and old stone guarding bedding. Its moth head was cracked open and its antennas snapped off, as if the statue had been smashed deliberately by an axe, and yet all of the precious gemstones were still inside it. So strange to see someone go to the trouble of defiling such a monument and yet not taking a single precious gem for trade or sale. Perhaps those stones were purely aesthetic pieces of art that had no materialistic value in Gnoll society. Either way, it meant I was dealing with a community without any means of economy or trade. I felt bad for all the poor souls that must have once lived in this world. Whatever they were intelligent enough to build things, and yet must have long forgotten aspects of morality such as honor, dignity, and respect. I had reached an area equivalent to where I thought the palace or southern alley streets should be, capable of finding a few parts of the south walls still built up in the distance, so it seemed a whole similar city and civilization had once existed there. It was like death without dignity, after the graves had been built. Clearly, no one bothered to stay around and help preserve the place for those who were lost. I passed many unmarked graves. Neither a word nor prayer had been left to help identify who each being was. It was a hauntingly tragic way to put someone to rest, their body left unable to disappear and yet unable to be properly remembered either. I decided it was in my best interest to stop thinking about them and spare myself from freaking out any more than I already was. Instead, I began considering what I should do next. My main goal was to find Arlo, and then a way to rescue Anera, while also searching for the way gnolls enter and leave their deathly homeland. My travels had come far, possibly further than Arlo could have rolled, and so I had no choice but to stop and rethink my options. The fact was he could have been hurt or in need of help, but maybe it was the opposite, that he was also uphill looking for me, or perhaps hiding from predators hoping I wouldn't scream out his name and give away our positions. I had almost left the open cemetery through its crumpled down southern walls when small plant life like beech ferns and tree shrubs began to wriggle once again, the branches of willow trees rattling into shadows while I compelled myself to move towards it, hoping such life meant Arlo was close by. I was afraid of provoking any predators lurking nearby, but too many minutes had passed, and Arlo was still nowhere to be seen. I had already checked behind every tomb and collapsed concrete wall, every gatepost and open field of trees and graves. My sanity reduced with every second I was stuck out there alone, following an old shredded stone slab-built path, and so I exited out of the old castle's ruins and headed into the hinterlands, dropping downwards from below, skittish and jumping at every sound. I was seeing every rock and stone in the distance shift as it formed the exact shape of my prince sitting down in injured weight of me. One of these shadows was prickly and had the hair of a prickly beach cactus plant, a wild baby cucumber sapling that was interweaved in a unique bundle identical to the exotic figure and shape of one that had been transferred from the forest and taken to Melena's water gardens as a piece of beach decoration. The stems were identical, while the pins and spines interlocked in the exact same way as the very plant I had to water only twice a year upon her request. To my surprise, the young plant hadn't grown with age, nor withered and disappeared along with all the other plants nearby. It looked exactly the same, serving as proof to me that I wasn't displaced years into the future, but merely within a parallel reality to my own. It became clear to me that the place I was in was just a shadow of the world I called home. Much like the dead plants surrounding the plush cacti, our two worlds were two rivals of which competed for the same light source, which meant one world was to starve, fail, and be on the verge of collapse, while the other more stronger counterpart got to bask and bathe in complete and unbridled sunshine. On the cosmic level, two similar worlds were competing with the same star for sunlight. The one the gnolls were born on happened to be the poor and unfortunate world that was on the losing side of the spectrum, facing a very cruel and imminent fate, as inch by inch the Reaper seemed to be tugging itself towards them, pulling them further into darkness and damnation of a cold and callous extinction. Everything made sense to me suddenly. Even the gateway to how I got there was starting to become simpler. How come Eli used the void between spaces to shift herself from one place to the next, occurring to me with a similar flash, that one missing link about her skill set and how it could build the bridge that brought us here. The ability to move tiny black holes next to each other was an otherworldly talent far more unique and extraordinary than the rest of us possessed. They weren't skills as easily defined as tinkering with aspects of sound or light like Arlo, Anera, and I did. Nor was it something of complex biochemistry either, like the mutually symbiotic relationship with skin bacteria that Radamant, Eris, and Midas had. Camilla's gifts were truly magical in the sense that she could alter matter, moving things into grouped random black holes and then out. White holes that occur spontaneously in nature. I thought back to one of the first times I ever saw her gifts for myself, how divine and out of the ordinary it all was. It was the day I first met Akoni. I had sat next to him by accident. He was an outcast and bookworm who watched from built-up wooden bleachers, while Camilla undertook the trials of the topside beach cliff training pits in order to revamp her name and be elected into the community as the next Legion commander for the capital and its borders. I could recall myself asking young Akoni how his mother could do the things that she could do. The two of us began having an in-depth discussion about it, the only two spectators in the grandstands more curious than they were entertained. The whole crowd was mesmerized by the vibrant colors of the portal stone Camilla was using for ulterior purposes. She manipulated the terrain from spewing lava to autumn woods, followed only by a frosty winter wonderland, all because she was capable of moving things through Midas's many marvelous gateway stones. Before I got used to them, her gifts used to fascinate me beyond compare. I thought she was divine. Something supernatural in nature because she could simply control things that were outside the realms of rationality and reality. It was how she made herself as cloudy as a shadow or ghost, to be composed of condensed fog and smoke when she willed it, able to use invisible nanoscopic wormholes to shift matter through the areas of transdimensional space. My father calls it a crossroad phase, Akoni said to me, spoken back in the days only a few years after his exile. Back when he believed his father was a good man and had a reason for doing the terrible things that he did. A child hellbent on reading every book and journal his father ever wrote. An upset child wanting nothing more than to be like his estranged father, despite all the kids that bullied him because of it. Coincidentally, this happened not a great deal before his major breakthrough discovery about fairy fire and the potential of creating a metal-eating plasma. If the universe is as big as it's told to be, and there truly are as many solar systems in this universe as there are grains of sand on Earth, then it's possible that somewhere out there, across the expanse, that there is an equal amount of stardust that just so happens to get compiled in exactly the same way and at the exact same time for multiple replicas of our world to be identically formed, he said, the very first incomprehensible statement he ever said to me, humbled only by the sheer lack of breath he had upon saying it. Meaning, he added with a huge anemic puff, statistically speaking, it's more likely there are worlds identical to ours out there somewhere in space than the chances of identical worlds not existing, he expelled to say, said almost sarcastically and condescending, as if he were used to mockery from this point of his statement, yet bullying himself only by the effort it took him to speak it out loud. The battle for breath he had, due to the poor congenital health he was born with, suffering from chronic exhaustion, anemia, and 1,000 other bouts of health conditions, like his crippling pneumonia, early acne, asthma, and very bad eyesight. I don't understand, I recall asking him. Of course you don't, he quipped back rudely. Well, explain it to me then, I added, my invitation to continue bringing a full state of confusion before eventually bringing a smile to an ordinarily bitter and expressionless face. Well, think about it. If all these reoccurring, mirror worlds were to propagate at the same rate along our own time scale, assuming our universe is only 1/4 through its life cycle, as current theory suggests, he continued, still out of breath, well, then that would mean by ratio that 3/4 of every parallel world would actually be identical to ours, with only 1/4 being subject to any slight, but dramatic cascading change. So the eventual point of divergence that turns a world from being a perfect reflection to being parallel has only occurred to 1/4 of those out there, he explained before using a wooden self-made air inhaler to help regain his breath after his lecture. I don't understand what you're saying or how it's even related to your mother, I've told him. Are you trying to say that there are parallel worlds to ours that exist somewhere in our own universe, up there in the stars? Yes, well, close. But no, actually, I'm talking about mirroring worlds within our own universe, he'd rephrased to me. So what? I'd said to him. How does that statement explain what your mother does? If it were all true and duplicate worlds could exist out there, what would it even matter to us, seeing as we can't fly up to go find them ourselves? I'd replied, expecting that to be the end of it. Because it means if my mother builds doorways that run on randomness and is shot out in any direction of the unknown, then there would always be a duplicate version of her doing the exact same thing, but in the exact opposite direction, which means anytime she opens a bridge from her side of the veil, somewhere out there another version of herself would also open the other half of the bridge, so they would meet in the middle. And she exchanges place with that reflection each time a new gateway is formed, he theorized. Okay, so your mother works with alternate versions of herself? Have you ever told her that? I'd pondered, still more or less oblivious to how she did something so physiologically unparalleled, feeling as if I knew less after I asked him the question than I did before, although of course too proud and afraid of looking dumb to ask him to explain it to me all over again. No, but that's the beauty of it, he'd said, believing I was following his thoughts, happy when he had another intellectual soul to have these kinds of deep discussions with, the grateful look on his young face making me feel like I was close to being as clever as him. Okay, why? I divulged curiously, trying to ignore a bombarding sound of wooden splinters and clay brick-built targets that his mother was violently smashing towards her opposition in order to win her duels and be elected the first-ever legioness of the Borderlands. Because when you cross that bridge, you will only ever enter a world no different than the one you came out from. In other words, whenever she crosses it, she takes the place of a world in which nothing at all has changed, seeing as the point of divergence between both worlds will have never occurred before her transition from one place to the other, he'd babbled. So every time my mother disappears, I get a new one who's exactly the same in every way possible, he joked, I believe. That was the very first of many crazy ramblings we had, and only upon my arrival into a hypothetical shadowing world had I the ability to realize what he, and by consequence, his father had tried to explain to me. That Camilla was the key to my current situation, the way out of the confining prison. The gnolls must have found a way to reconfigure her gateway stone and use the residual eclipses of the old faltering sunspire to power their voyage back and forth between both worlds, which meant her gateway stones were going to be the only way out of the gnolls' homeland as well. A big problem, considering much of the land had fallen to degradation and decay. And although clear of head and calm of mind, I did feel as though I was on the verge of insanity, as Midas had been. He was the man who had first learned of the dying world and had taken some type of chance to try and save it. A selfless act most costly, considering all that he had lost because of it.